to serve a full term as treasurer?
I don't recall.
You don't recall? Because at least the Democrats are saying you did, and then you turned around and ran for Senate. So is that breaking a pledge?
Well, I'm planning right now to continue being the state treasurer. I think if you look at the record of the office, it speaks for itself, Marty. I mean, when I first came in, as I mentioned, Ohio's fiscal transparency ranking was 46th in the country. Now our fiscal transparency ranking is #1 in the country. When I first came into the treasurer's office, our financial ranking was 43rd in the country. When I ran for re-election as state treasurer, it was 7th in the country. And so I think we're running one of the preeminent state treasurer offices in America. We're really setting an example for how a state treasurer office should be run. And it's one of the reasons I think that I got re-elected by double digits. And so regardless of what happened during the first campaign when I was running for state treasurer, obviously the voters liked what they saw, they liked the results of the office, and they decided to re-elect me by double digits. And I'm confident that come next year the voters will elect me to the U.S. Senate, because there's a very stark and clear generational contrast and ideological contrast. As I mentioned, in this election I'm going to be 40 years old. Sherrod Brown's going to be 40 years in politics. He's been running for office since Richard Nixon was president. Think about that for a second. I've never lived in Washington. I've never worked in Washington. I have no desire to spend my entire adult life in Washington. And so I think that contrast, that generational contrast, but also the ideological contrast with the guy who's voting to represent Massachusetts instead of Ohio, I'm confident that that'll bring us victory come next November.
Josh, are you pledging to support this pledge only, or generally any pledge or any effort out there right now to impose term limits, including the effort right now for a constitutional convention on this subject?
Well, I definitely support this pledge for term limits. I need to look at other ones. Generally speaking, I'm a supporter of term limits. I mean, there's different ways to skin a cat. So U.S. term limits, their organization advocates for 2 6-year terms for senators and 3 2-year terms for House members. I support that. If there's other ideas out there that have a little different limit on the terms, I could possibly be supportive of that as well. I'd have to see the details of it. But I think the key is getting into the Constitution term limits, breaking the stranglehold that career Washington politicians have right now on the people.
And what have you done so far to forward this idea?
This is day one. We're launching this today, and so I'm going to be working with folks around the country, Democrats and Republicans, anyone who wants to work with us. I mean, not just Democrats or Republicans. Democrat, Republicans, independents, libertarian, vegetarian, everything in between. Like anyone who wants to work with us on this term limits initiative, we're open to it. Because as I said, Jim, Sherrod Brown's a big part of the problem, but he's not the only part of the problem. There's Republicans here in Ohio and throughout America that are part of the problem as well.
Treasurer, this was a big thing that you talked about a lot during your last race with Senator Brown. Term limits, his time spent in Washington. What in Ohio are you seeing that you think will make this message more effective now that maybe didn't take 5 years ago?
Well, I think 5 years ago was a totally different campaign, and it was a different environment. And I think right now, if you look at the mood of the voters and the mood of the people, they're angry with career Washington politicians. They look at people like Sherrod Brown and others as part of the problem. And I'm not sure that was the case 5 years ago, but it's definitely the case right now. And it's not just about what happened last year in the presidential election. It's a lot larger than that. And I think this concept of transferring the power from the politicians to the people, it's a concept that's really taken hold among folks throughout the political spectrum, on the far right, on the far left, and everything in between. And so I think it's a totally different environment. I think back then people supported it, but now there's more of a emotional and passionate thrust behind their support for term limits now.
Josh, when you came out in favor of term limits 5 years ago, it was part of a package that also included withholding congressional paychecks if there wasn't a budget passed on time, and no more public pensions for former members who become lobbyists. Are you reiterating those pledges as well today?
So today we're only announcing this term limits pledge. Jeremy, over the next many months, you will likely see me talking about some of those issues and some new ones as well. And so when I talk about the contrast, this crisp, clear contrast between me and Sherrod Brown, a lot of that contrast has to do with how Washington is infected. Some people call it a swamp, others call it a cartel, whatever you want to call it. I think everyone can agree that it's broken there. And so over time, over the next many months, we're going to be announcing a variety of reforms to take on Washington career politicians, to take on lobbyists, to take on the revolving door that I think a lot of people find gross in Washington, where people are just trying to cash in on power and cash in on their friends. And so, yes, Jeremy, over time we're going to be talking about a lot of those. But today, the only announcement we're making is on term limits specifically.
Josh, you said this is about transferring power back to the people.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't this really taking a right away from people? If I want to vote for somebody for a third term, if this becomes law, I won't be able to do that.
It's a good question, Marty. I believe this transfers power to the people because there's a huge advantage when these congressmen and senators are there for decades and generations with their incumbency, and they use the Washington incumbency to help themselves get elected. So, for instance, if you look in Washington, there's a ton of DC politicians who use, it's called the franking privilege. This doesn't exist with state or local folks, but in Washington they have this franking privilege where they can send out free glossy mailers, and they look like campaign mailers, but actually they're paid for by the taxpayers. And so there's a lot of advantages like that that Washington politicians have that help advance their cause, but have nothing to do with what's good for the people.
Josh, this is the latest in a number of issues that you've echoed what Donald Trump's campaign platform was.